Is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Can you be jailed for friending the wrong person? You'll hear the story of Rod Coronado in a minute.
Just enough to lose it all too young. You never wanted anything, never asked for this at all, but they took you anyway. You could only crawl. How can they justify what they've done? Who will remember you when you're gone? They'll just take another, keep on taking more.
Enough's Enough by Michael McDonald Taylor and David Bernazzani. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Sharif Abdel-Qaddous.
The longtime radical animal liberation activist Rod Coronado has been sent back to prison for 4 months after a U.S. district judge in Michigan ruled he had violated the terms of his parole. Coronado's offense was associating with fellow radical activist Mike Rozelle by accepting a friend request from Rozelle on the social networking website Facebook. In accepting the friend request, Coronado's action amounted to one click of his computer's mouse. Coronado was also using what his parole officer called an unauthorized computer. Rod Coronado is a well-known Native American activist who participated in direct actions with the Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front during the 1990s. He spent 4.5 years in federal prison after he was convicted of aiding and abetting arson at a Michigan State University research facility. The fire destroyed years of data that was used to benefit the fur industry. In 2006, Coronado wrote a letter from prison renouncing property damage as a tactic and advocating social change through other means. But in recent years, the federal government has continued to target Coronado.
The journalist Dean Kuipers has been following Rod Coronado's story for almost 20 years. Last year, Kuipers published the book Operation Bite Back, Rod Coronado's War to Save American Wilderness. Dean Kuipers joins us from Los Angeles, an editor at the Los Angeles Times. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Tell us what has just happened to Rod Coronado.
Well, Rodney was under the provisions of his probation. He had been serving a 1-year jail sentence that he finished in 2009, and he was under probation. And as was pointed out in the intro to the program, evidently he had some restrictions on him regarding which computer he could use and what he could do with that computer and who he could associate with. Now, I don't think these were very well defined from what I understand. I don't think Facebook, for instance, was specifically mentioned on there. But as has been pointed out, he got a friend request from Mike Rozelle, who's a very well-known character throughout the movement, both radical and non-radical environmental movement. And when he accepted this friend request, evidently the federal government decided that that was a violation of his parole.
So, Dean Kuipers, this is guilt by Facebook association?
Evidently. There are quite a number of people who are probably in the same position as what Rod is in now. There have been a lot of prosecutions of radical environmentalists, activists over the last 5 years or so, beginning with quite a large prosecution that happened in 2005, centered around Eugene, Oregon, with a number of activists involved, a 65-count indictment, like 20 different people involved. A lot of those people went to jail. A lot of those people are facing the same kind of probation restrictions that Rodney has been facing and will now face again, because unfortunately Rod is going back to jail for 4 months, a 4-month sentence that he starts later this month, and then he has to start his 30-month, I think, or 3-year probation all over again. So I think a lot of people are watching this case because they want to figure out what exactly the federal government is going to do and how it's going to treat these radical animal rights and environmental activists.
Dean Kuipers, you're a contributor to the Los Angeles Times. You are an editor at Los Angeles City Beat, and you've been following Rod Coronado's case for 20 years. Give us a thumbnail sketch of who Rod is and what happened to him.
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually no longer with City Beat, but I am at the LA Times. Rod came to some notoriety in 1986, so quite a long time ago, when he was working with the Sea Shepherds, who are very well known now for their show, The Whale Wars, which is a popular show on TV. Rod and another activist went to Iceland, where they observed the whaling operations in Iceland in 1986, and were there for about a month observing, and then one night snuck onto the boats. They had four sort of hunter-killer whaling ships there, and sank two of their boats in the harbor, and then got away. This got a lot of media publicity, as is true to the Sea Shepherd's usual tactic. They immediately claimed responsibility for this, and Paul Watson, in fact, the captain of the Sea Shepherds, offered himself up for prosecution. But because Iceland was whaling in what was considered a violation of International Whaling Commission rules and the ban on certain kinds of whaling, they decided not to prosecute him because they didn't want the media publicity. This is a way that Sea Shepherd has been operating for years. So Rod was big time on the map at that point as a radical environmentalist. In the early 1990s, he was doing an investigation of the fur industry in the United States. He was trying to get some video footage of conditions on fur farms that some East Coast environmental groups wanted to use for a publicity campaign. I say East Coast because he was working mostly on the West Coast and the Mountain West. In the course of Rod's investigation with another activist, he decided that the way that he could best affect the conditions on these farms was to go after the research and development arm of the mink industry. And that was a very small group of people who were mostly university scientists who were doing research on genetic and breeding issues, diet issues, that kind of thing. And Rod was pretty good about targeting exactly the right people and in terms of what he considered to be the right people. And he used arson as his tool, and he would go to these university labs or research offices when there were nobody around, surveil them for quite a number of days, and then burn these labs. This was a campaign that went from 1991 through 1992 into 93, and then he was identified from one of these actions in Michigan State and went underground. Rod is a Yaqui Indian by heritage, so it was quite easy for him at that point to go underground and to live on Indian reservations, which became a whole other fascinating part of his story, where he changed his identity multiple times and was hidden and helped to live on Indian reservations across the country, mostly in the West again, until he was finally captured in '94 on the Pascua Yaqui Reservation and did 5 years for arson. Now, this was part of the calculation, I guess, for Rod, was that at that point, anyways, the penalty for doing arson was 5 years, and he got 5 years. And he had figured, even when he started this, that arson was a very dangerous thing to use. He, like many other activists, at least he claimed, was reluctant to use arson. It's difficult to control. There's a good reason why we have, quite stiff penalties for anybody who does an arson, even one that doesn't hurt anybody. But he knew that he could do the 5 years, so that was part of his calculation, and he did the 5 years. Rodney came back on my radar screen only a couple years ago, actually, in 2007, even though I had sort of stayed in touch with his activities, and he's always involved in something very interesting, even if it was a legal campaign. In 2007, he was prosecuted again, but this time he was prosecuted for terrorism. Now, Rod has always sort of been intimately involved with the sort of creeping progression of the definition of terrorism for radical activists in this country over the last 15, 20 years. because a couple, anyways, of the laws that were passed about domestic federal terrorism were passed partly because of him. In 2003 is where this latest bit begins. He was doing a series of talks across the country, which was his sort of standard activist action at that point. He was doing some talks in which he would talk about the whaling action, he would talk about his anti-fur campaign, and as part of that series of talks, he did a talk in San Diego at a gay lesbian center there. It was an open talk, public talk. You know, it was advertised throughout the local activist community there. And as part of his talk, he answered a question at the end during the Q&A period from someone in the audience who said, "How did you make these incendiaries?" This was a standard question that Rod evidently had answered many times before. His take on that question was that this was an easy thing to do. He wanted to show that he was not some sort of bombing madman or some kind of a demolitions expert. But he held up a jug of gasoline, or a jug of apple juice, and said, imagine this was filled with gasoline. And then he went on to describe very briefly that you could do a number of different things that would make that burn, and then run away. And that was the sense, that was the essence of his type of incendiary device. There were federal agents, or federal task force agents anyways, in the audience that night, as there always are at a Rodney Coronado speech. They decided that this was incitement, and that under the rules of the federal terrorism law that had developed by 2003, that this was a crime of not just incitement to arson, but that this was a crime of federal terrorism. And it took a number of years to put the case together, but in 2007 they finally went to trial on that. The jury seemed to not quite buy the incitement prosecution. There was a hung jury that was hung in Rod's favor. The crime that he had committed during a talk really was quite a new area of territory for First Amendment cases. It seemed to fail every one of the tests that we have, under Brandenburg for determining what is protected speech and what isn't, meaning that it seemed like it was protected speech. But there was a hung jury, and the government came back to Rod and said, guess what, we have a whole bunch of your speeches on tape. We are happy to prosecute all of those speeches. And Rodney, who at that point has 2 young children and is really trying to put his family together, decided that it would be better for him to take a plea and do a year than to go through all these prosecutions, so he took a plea. And he did a year in jail and got out in the spring of 2009, I believe, if I have that correct. And since then he's been on probation. He has been serving his probation in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area. And the judge who has been overseeing his probation and oversaw his sentencing there has been pretty tough on him, and has been really showing that under the laws that exist now, that can be pretty stiff for radical activists and animal rights and environmental activists who have sort of get tripped up by these, the sort of steadily increasing definition of what could be considered federal terrorism.
Right. Well, you have this this changing of federal law to prosecute animal rights activists as terrorists. We had the passage in 2006 of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. But finally, talk about how Rod Coronado, the prosecution of him, fits into the so-called Green Scare.
Well, the Green Scare was the name that they, of course, that was used sort of beginning around this 2005 prosecution in Eugene. That's when that word